December 19th, 2001. Buenos Aires is burning. Grocery stores are being looted. Banks have steel shutters welded shut. A crowd of 30,000 surrounds the presidential palace, banging pots and pans in a cacophony that sounds like the collapse of civilization itself. 5 presidents will resign in the span of 2 weeks. The country that once called itself the granary of the world is defaulting on $95 billion in debt. Middle-class families who went to bed with savings accounts wake up to find their money has simply vanished, locked behind a government decree with a name that sounds almost cute. El Corralito, the little fence. But this isn't a story about a sudden catastrophe. This is a story about a cure that became a poison, about a country that tied its hands behind its back and called it discipline, about the most seductive trap in economics, the illusion of stability bought at the cost of flexibility, and about the fatal mistake of believing that credibility with foreign investors matters more than the ability to breathe. How does a country go from economic miracle to complete collapse in less than 3 years? The answer lies in a single piece of paper, a law passed in 1991 that seemed brilliant at the time, a law that promised to end decades of chaos, a law that would strangle Argentina to death. Let's go back to where this actually begins. The 1980s in Argentina were hell. Hyperinflation reached 5,000%. The peso became worthless so quickly that stores stopped printing price tags. Workers demanded to be paid daily because waiting until Friday meant your salary bought half as much. Shoppers would sprint through supermarkets, grabbing items before the prices changed mid-shopping. The government tried freezing prices, printing new currencies, forcing stores to stay open. Nothing worked. Trust in the peso was gone. Trust in the government was gone. Argentina was trapped in a death spiral where everyone expected prices to rise, so they did, which made everyone expect them to rise more. Enter Carlos Menem, elected president in 1989. His economy minister, Domingo Cavallo, proposed something radical, the Convertibility Law. Starting April 1991, 1 Argentine peso would equal exactly $1 US. Not approximately, not a floating target, exactly. And here's the key. This wasn't just a promise. This was a legal straitjacket. Argentina would only print pesos if it had dollars in reserve to back them. 1 for 1. A currency board. The government literally surrendered its ability to print money. And it worked. Almost overnight, hyperinflation stopped. Prices stabilized. Foreign investors who had fled Argentina for years suddenly poured money back in. If the peso equaled the dollar by law, then investing in Argentina was like investing in a high-yield American asset. Capital flooded in. The economy grew by over 8% annually through the mid-90s. Buenos Aires felt like Paris again. Shopping malls opened. Argentine tourists traveled to Miami. The country privatized everything. Oil companies, airlines, utilities, pension funds. The Washington Consensus loved it. The IMF held Argentina up as the model for emerging markets. But the thing about straitjackets is that they work great until you need to move your arms. The mechanism of the trap was simple, brutal, and invisible to most people enjoying the boom. When you peg your currency to the dollar, you import American monetary policy whether it fits your economy or not. When the U.S. Federal Reserve raises interest rates, you have to raise yours, even if your economy is slowing down. When the dollar strengthens against other currencies, your currency strengthens too, even if it makes your exports uncompetitive. And that's exactly what happened. Through the late 90s, the dollar rallied. That meant the peso rallied. Argentine beef, wine, and wheat suddenly became expensive for buyers in Europe, Japan, and Brazil. Brazil, Argentina's largest trading partner, devalued its currency in 1999, making Brazilian goods cheaper. Argentine factories couldn't compete. Exports collapsed. At the same time, the government was spending like the boom would never end. Provinces ran deficits. Corruption was rampant. But here's the critical point. Normally, a country facing recession and falling exports would devalue its currency to boost competitiveness. It's economics 101. Make your goods cheaper, attract buyers, stimulate growth. Argentina couldn't. The peso was locked to the dollar. The only way to devalue was to break the law that had ended hyperinflation. So instead, Argentina borrowed. If you can't print money and you can't devalue, you borrow to cover the gap. The debt-to-GDP ratio climbed from 30% in 1993 to over 60% by 2000. International lenders kept lending because they believed in the peg. The peg meant stability. Stability meant Argentina would pay back its debts. Except the recession was deepening. Unemployment hit 15%, then 18%. Tax revenues fell. The government borrowed more to pay existing debts. Classic debt trap. And here's where the geopolitics mattered. Argentina wasn't just borrowing from banks. It was borrowing from the IMF, from global bond markets, from pension funds in Italy and Japan. The country had become a test case. If Argentina failed, it would prove that the Washington consensus model, privatization plus fiscal discipline plus currency pegs, didn't work. Investors in every emerging market would panic. Brazil, Turkey, and Russia, all of which had IMF programs, would face capital flight. The contagion risk was enormous, so the IMF kept lending. In December 2000, they put together a $40 billion rescue package, the largest in IMF history at that time. The message, "We believe in the peg. We believe Argentina will recover. Keep the faith." But on the streets of Buenos Aires, faith was dying. By mid-2001, the recession had lasted 3 years. Wages were falling. Unemployment was above 20%, and people were starting to ask the obvious question, why are we suffering to maintain a one-to-one exchange rate? Who does this help? The answer was foreign creditors. The peg meant Argentina's dollar-denominated debts stayed manageable. If the peso devalued, those debts would explode in peso terms, making default inevitable. Breaking the peg would destroy Argentina's creditworthiness, but maintaining the peg was destroying the economy. This is the fatal mistake, and it wasn't made in a single moment. It was made in 1,000 small decisions throughout 2001. Every time Economy Minister Domingo Cavallo, the architect of the original peg, was asked if Argentina would devalue, he said no. Every time the IMF reviewed the program, they demanded more austerity to maintain the peg, more spending cuts, more tax increases. Public sector wages were cut by 13%. The government even tried a bizarre scheme where people could pay taxes with government bonds instead of pesos, trying to preserve cash without technically printing money. The mistake was believing that credibility mattered more than reality, that if Argentina just showed enough discipline, enough willingness to suffer, the recession would end and growth would return. That breaking the peg would be worse than keeping it. They were wrong. In July 2001, bank deposits started falling. Slowly at first, people were nervous. By November, it was a flood. Over $15 billion fled the country in weeks. The wealthy moved money to Miami, to Switzerland, anywhere with dollars. If the peg broke, peso deposits would be worthless. Get your money out while 1 peso still equaled $1. The government panicked. On December 1st, Economy Minister Cavallo announced El Corralito. Bank accounts were frozen. You could withdraw 250 pesos a week. That's it. Businesses couldn't pay suppliers. People couldn't access their life savings. The middle class, which had trusted the banking system, which had believed the peg meant safety, felt betrayed. The streets exploded. The cacerolazo, the pot-banging protests, started spontaneously. People just walked outside with kitchen pots and started banging. The noise was deafening, primal. Grocery stores were looted. 27 people died in clashes with police. President Fernando de la Rua tried to impose a state of siege. It made things worse. On December 20th, he resigned and fled the presidential palace in a helicopter while protesters stormed the gates. 4 more presidents cycled through in 2 weeks. Literally. The constitutional succession was followed one after another as each president either refused the job or was forced out within days. On December 23rd, Argentina defaulted on $95 billion in debt, the largest sovereign default in history. And then finally, in January 2002, the peg broke. The peso was floated. Within months, it collapsed to 4 pesos per dollar. Every debt denominated in dollars, every mortgage, every business loan, quadrupled in peso terms overnight. Banks holding peso deposits but owing dollar debts were instantly insolvent. The government forcibly converted dollar deposits to pesos at the old 1-to-1 rate, then watched the peso collapse. Savers lost 75% of their wealth. The cost was staggering. Unemployment hit 25%. Poverty reached 57% of the population. A country that had considered itself European, educated, sophisticated, middle class, watched half its citizens fall into poverty in a matter of months. The geopolitical humiliation was complete. Argentina became a cautionary tale. The IMF model was discredited. The Washington consensus began to unravel. Here's what we should understand. The peg wasn't stupid when it was implemented. It genuinely ended hyperinflation. The fatal mistake was refusing to abandon it when circumstances changed. When exports collapsed, when recession took hold, when the medicine was clearly killing the patient, they kept prescribing more. They confused the tool for the goal. The point wasn't to maintain a 1-to-1 exchange rate. The point was prosperity, stability. When the peg stopped delivering those things, it should have been abandoned. We see the same pattern now. Countries tying themselves to rigid monetary rules, to currency unions, to debt obligations that demand austerity in the face of recession. The Eurozone periphery during the 2010s. Developing nations with dollar-denominated debt facing Fed rate hikes. Lebanon's peg collapsing in 2020. The pattern repeats. The belief that credibility and market confidence matter more than the ability to respond to crisis. That showing discipline to foreign investors is worth domestic suffering. Argentina eventually recovered. The 2000s commodities boom saved them. China's hunger for soybeans and beef brought dollars flooding back. But the scars remain. Argentines learned not to trust their government, their banks, or their currency. They learned to dollarize everything, to move money abroad at the first sign of trouble. That lack of trust is its own trap, making every future crisis worse. The lesson isn't that pegs are always bad or that austerity never works. The lesson is simpler and harder. Systems that can't adapt will break. When you build an economic structure that demands perfection, that allows no flexibility, that says, we will suffer any amount of pain to maintain this one rule, you're not building stability, you're building brittleness, and brittle things shatter. Argentina proved that credibility without legitimacy is worthless. That markets might love your discipline right up until your population takes to the streets with pots and pans. That sometimes the courageous choice isn't holding the line, it's knowing when to let go. The money wasn't real, the stability was an illusion, and the cost of maintaining that illusion was a country.